On behalf of ISAS, I bid you all a very warm welcome. The topic for today's seminar is Discontents, view from post-colonial democracy and its discontents, the view from Pakistan. And few have better credentials to address this subject than Professor Asim Sajjad Akhtar. Educated in the Northwestern University, Yale, and University of London, he is at present senior faculty in Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad, and was earlier associated with LUMS Lahore. He's authored many scholarly articles for learned journals and authored books mostly focused on peasant issues in Pakistan and also devolution under the Musharraf regime. He is a regular contributor to the Daily Dawn. Professor Akhtar is also an activist, very closely associated with trade unions, peasant groups, urban squatters, and the like. Some of you may recall that in 2011, he was a participant in the diaspora convention that ISAS held. Pakistan today, ladies and gentlemen, is in focus, largely because it is in the cusp of major political changes. It is about to see through the first peaceful political transition from one civilian government to another, or perhaps a continuation of the same government depending on electoral decision and electoral verdict. Yes, Pakistan has its discontents. Yes, Pakistan is riddled with sectarian strife. Yes, Pakistan has known more than its share of violence. And yet Pakistan has much to be content with. Its potentials are enormous. It has considerable, what we call soft power in its culture, arts, literature, architecture. It has a hugely talented diaspora. And it is militarily strong, which many may argue that is also its bane. But some questions persist in the mind of the international community. Does real power reside in the formal governments? Indeed, does what we are about to see, elections on the 11th May, will it imply a real change or just cosmetic? Or does actual power reside in other elements in society like the military, the feudals, the bureaucracy, captains of industry, or even the civil society? Or do these elements that I've just named, do they form some kind of a comprador elite, structurally linked in a dependency relationship with the former metropolitan centers of the colonial powers? In the synopsis, we note a mention of Partha Chatterjee's focus on political society being more all-encompassing in the post-colonial period, replacing civil society, a Western insertion in the colonial era. This is largely, Partha writes, Chatterjee writes on the Indian situation, but is this also relevant in the case of Pakistan, given some of Pakistan's unique characteristics as well? Now, to hear on all this and more, let us turn to a very distinguished speaker, Professor Akhtar, who has a microphone.
Chatterjee and to ISAS and all those folks who have helped organize this talk, and to all of you for attending. As was just mentioned in that brief introduction, Pakistan is often, at least has been, particularly over the last decade or so, been in the news. I'm glad that in that brief introduction there wasn't mention wasn't made of that what I find to be a god-awful word, terrorism, because that's about all we hear. Unfortunately, of course, there's a reason for the way the popular media often depicts Pakistan, but I think anyone who has more than just a cursory interest in that country and society and how it's changing recognizes that that depiction is often, at the very least, one-dimensional, if not superficial. I would also, and what I'm going to try and do today is I'd also like to suggest that, unfortunately, many of the analyses of Pakistan that are not about terrorism, that are about its politics or about its economy or what have you, also tend to be somewhat superficial. Not necessarily in scholarly circles, but even in scholarly circles we find that, and I was just mentioning to someone who I was chatting to before the lecture started, that even in scholarly circles there's a dearth of real, solid, empirical work on what is happening in that country, what's changing in particular. A lot of emphasis in analyses of Pakistan is on what's not changing, on this very obsolete, established, entrenched structure of power that seems to just persist through the ages, featuring the omnipotent feudals that just don't go away, featuring an over-bloated security apparatus, military establishment that continues to be an arbiter in many ways. And a lot of that is true, but a lot of it is also increasingly not true, in the sense that insofar as there's a story of continuity when thinking about Pakistan, there's also a story of significant change. So let me just give you some sound bites. There was a report by UN Habitat recently, which actually, by various measures, says that Karachi is the world's biggest metropolitan center, with a population just within the city limits of approaching 25 million, and wider Karachi, touching the 30 million mark. And it's not just Karachi. There are a number of sociologists, prominent among them Mohammed Qadir, who's based in Canada at Queen's University, who have long argued that Pakistan is now a predominantly urban society. And that's just not a technicality. I would say, I think, I'm fairly convinced by a figure of something like 50% of the population is now urban. And urban means not just in terms of the wider geography or the wider landscape, but also what might be termed urban attitudes and values and so on and so forth. There's, despite what we often like to think, an increasingly large number of even elected politicians, and we'll come to that shortly, hail from non-traditional, non-feudal backgrounds. There's I would suggest to you, one of the biggest myths about Pakistan is that there is this, as I said, this omnipotent feudal elite that has sort of been in power for decades and decades since the British era. And there's a handful of families. Back in the day, in 1968, Mahbub ul-Haq famously called it the 22 families. There's definitely many more than 22 now that are major political and economic players. And even in the electoral realm, some of you may have heard of, there's this rather, I'd say, eccentric politician from a district near Multan called Muzaffargarh, who was disqualified quite infamously for having a fake degree from his National Assembly seat. His name is Jamshed Dasti, who, by the way, proceeded to go back and win the by-election. And Jamshed Dasti from Muzaffargarh. Muzaffargarh is famous for another reason, because one of the big feudals in Pakistan, Ghulam Mustafa Khan, who was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's chief minister in Punjab for some time in the 1970s, is also from Muzaffargarh. And so from that very seat, from the seat of feudal power, so to speak, Jamshed Dasti, who is the son of a wrestler, and I kid you not, a small town sort of, what you would call, a performer, without any land, without any major source of, landed powers or anything else that's entrenched social power. And there's many such stories. I wouldn't say that a majority of elected politicians hail from such backgrounds, but such stories are, if we look for them, if we search deep enough, we'll find a non-negligible number of figures. And actually, interestingly, that can be traced back to the era of Zia ul-Haq and party-less elections and local bodies and so on and so forth. So let's go back to that, which is, I would suggest to you, if there is a story of continuity, then we have to start with this military, with the Pakistani military. I often feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but unfortunately that's exactly what one has to do. I was this morning listening to a radio show on the BBC, and there was a DFID, Department of Foreign International Development representative being interviewed about a recent, I think the parliamentary committee just said, well, we're going to give more aid to Pakistan, but contingent on tax reform, which is all good and well. I think we'd all agree that that's very important. But I find it rather odd, actually, that there was the story went on about how the Pakistani elite doesn't pay taxes, which is true. But the biggest segment of that elite, and I'm not just talking about households, I'm not just talking about individuals, I'm talking about in terms of a corporate entity that that benefits greatly from its capture of the state, is the military and its huge corporate empire, which is not only not taxed, in fact, it eats away at the public exchequer by getting a lot of hidden subsidies. And they're everywhere. They're in banking, they make cement, they make fertilizers, they make cereals. There's no manufacturing in that country which the military doesn't have anything to do with. So whichever way we look at it, I think the story has to start there. And Professor Chaudhry, I think, in his introduction, sort of hinted at that. So, when we talk about elections, or we talk about the political process, which, as he rightly pointed out, for the very first time, we appear as smooth as can happen in Pakistan. We appear to be having some kind of smooth transition from one elected government to the next. But to what extent has this elected government, the ones that preceded it, the one that's going to come in after May 11th, assuming that's when the election is held, to what extent do they actually exercise power? To what extent do they actually make policy? To what extent does the parliament, the elected body of people, to what extent is it the supreme institution of the state? And unfortunately, the answer is not a great deal. We need a lot more continuity of the political process before the military is cut down to size. And as I said, this is no longer just a question of military governments coming in and taking power, or military governments or military sort of generals doing arm twisting and ensuring they get a big share of the budget. This is also about now an autonomous corporate empire that is both linked to the military's political power but now doesn't necessarily require it to take over the reins of government per se. So insofar as there is a story of continuity, that I would suggest to you is it. Because when I say continuity, I suggest what I'm hinting at is the fact that the military in this part of the subcontinent is in fact, Tan Tayong's work is established, has been powerful and has exercised or has played sort of, during the British period, there was a unique, what was called the Punjab School of Administration, where military officers were inducted into civilian positions to a much greater extent and with much greater power than anywhere else in British India. So there's a long story of continuity. Much of modern day Punjab as we know it was developed through the building of cantonments, through the issuing of land grants, through the building of military farms, which produced all sorts of stuff, dairy products for the British Indian Army. So there's a long sort of history of what is today's Pakistani army having deeply entrenched interests within this particular part of the subcontinent. And what I want to suggest to you, as I said, which is often missed, is that this is social power. There's a sociology of power that we need to understand. There's in the Potwar Plateau, which is the northern part of Punjab, you will not find a single family which has not sent one or two individuals into the army, and that sometimes continues over generations. So it's not just a question of a handful of generals. I think what I'm trying to suggest to you is that there's an entire political and economic structure within which a large number of people, ordinary people included, are deeply invested. So these are, in some ways perplexing issues because it's not just about cutting a few generals down to size. It's about recognizing, and of course Pakistan is not the only country that has or will struggle with these sorts of issues. We've got numerous examples. There's the Turkeys of the world, the Indonesias of the world, the Nigerias of the world, which have strong militaries, but strong military means a military that is deeply entrenched into large parts of society. So it will be a while yet before we can talk of an elected parliament being able to really be the final decision maker with regards to the fundamental structural concerns of Pakistani society. Now, on the other hand, the perception that's developed, and again, before I come back to this whole question of politicians and the folks who democracy is supposed to be about, there's another institution of state, which historically has sort of been the military's B team, but in recent times has emerged, so to speak, as an autonomous power center, which is the superior judiciary. And I think that there's a great deal of, there's been a significant amount of euphoria associated with the judiciary's role right from the time that the Chief Justice sort of defied General Musharraf. And I don't mean to rain on anyone's parade, but I don't share that euphoria a great deal, despite having been on the streets for long periods of time to support the restoration of the judiciary at the time. The reason that I say that has again to do with, and this might resonate a little bit, not just in Pakistan, but other parts of South Asia, perhaps even other post-colonial countries, parts of Africa perhaps. The whole phenomenon of the judiciary seems to me a bit like our obsession with, or our Messiah complex. So we've got deep structural concerns. It's a deeply unequal society. Resources are very unequally distributed. Power is concentrated in the unelected state apparatuses. we've got a host of other social concerns which I haven't even touched on yet. And as was the case with military generals in the past, with Iftikhar Chaudhry as well, your namesake as it turns out, the Chief Justice, there's been this perception that perhaps he has a magic wand and he can fix all the problems. And this one individual can take on this very deeply entrenched structure of power. And we get very excited when for example, when he disqualified Jamshed Dasti, or he took on all of these so-called corrupt politicians. And he's taken up, to be fair, he's taken up cases which in the past perhaps were no-go zones. But the problem with that is, of course, is that there is no Messiah solution. There is no quick fix. There cannot be a quick fix. Because, as I said, there are some deeply rooted, entrenched structures. And, there was a Suimoto case, and Suimoto has become this big new thing in Pakistan. So the Chief Justice every day takes Suimoto notice of XYZ issue. So one day he took Suimoto notice of the rise in sugar prices. And he issued a judgment after 2 days saying there will be a limit, this will be the ceiling on sugar prices, which I found rather comical, actually, as if one could dictate what sugar prices can and should be, at the very least without an acknowledgement of how hoarding takes place and how racketeering and the black market actually works, which wasn't part of his judgment at all. It was just XYZ politician is responsible, or XYZ policymaker has failed, therefore this is the ceiling. And a number of such sort of decisions, issues have been raised. And of course the silver lining is that those issues are being raised. Not the sugar issue per se, but for example, the one issue which I found to be very important that the Chief Justice took up was the issue of disappeared, kidnapped persons in Balochistan. Those of you who follow Pakistan know that hundreds, if not thousands, of Baloch political activists have been disappeared over the last 8 to 10 years. And the overwhelming evidence is by our own intelligence apparatus, not by someone else, but our own intelligence apparatus, which simply refuses to countenance the Baloch nationalist struggle, which is a different debate entirely. But the Chief Justice took this up. So there are issues that he's taken up, but the whole manner of his judicial activism sort of is built upon this notion that there can be this one very powerful individual acting in the proverbial public interest who can come and sort things out. And that's not really how it can work, unfortunately. Now what I want to tie that to, which is sort of, my broader interest as a sociologist, is what was in the abstract and what Professor Chaudhry mentioned briefly. This whole question of the middle classes, civil society, and the whole question of politics more generally. So, our love affair with generals in the past, and with just Superior Court judges now, I would suggest to you, actually is born of a deep, and I hate to use the word, but rather colonial contempt for politics. And when I say our, I mean particularly educated segments of society, the urban middle classes, the proverbial public opinion makers. And if you turn on, and Pakistanis have developed a rather unnerving addiction to TV talk shows. If you turn on the prototypical TV talk show, there will be an anchor, who have also become very well known in recent years, and there will be politicians. And what's going on in some ways is almost like slapstick humor, where the anchor is goading these politicians into going at one another and sort of reinforcing that contempt about politicians, saying, look, this is all these guys do day in, day out. They just go at each other. They're not interested in the public interest. They're not interested in making policies. They're interested in privatizing public resources and then just having a go with one another. And those shows are popular, I would suggest, for that particular reason, because there's an audience that tunes in every night to their favorite anchor and sort of doesn't know whether to laugh or cry as they're watching the show. But both before that show and after that show, in the living room or the dining room conversation is about how all these damn politicians have messed the country up. And historically, that sort of translated into, okay, we need a general who will come up and clean up shop, get rid of all these guys. And now, because we've had that experience numerous times, it's not worked. And perhaps because it's no longer really politically correct in the 21st century to call for military rulers to come up and clean up shop. Now we have a judge who's the designated messiah, who's taking on all these corrupt politicians. But what's interesting about this whole discourse, and this is what I would call the civil society discourse, is, as I said, is that there's big, huge holes in the argument. So, for example, as I suggested to you earlier, if there is a problem with, I don't even call it sort of selected issues of corruption, I'd call it institutionalized corruption. If there's a problem that's a structural problem with what we might call corruption, then it's not, I would suggest to you, even if we look at the volume of resources that we're talking about, then the institutions of the state, including the military, are much more culpable than XYZ politician per se. Because as I said, it's institutionalized, it's been going on for decades. It's almost legal in some sense. And those sorts of issues are completely missed out in this whole discourse of corruption. Here, of course, I think we have a good comparative example with Anna Hazare in India, and the kind of sociology of the Anna Hazare movement, which of course now has been studied in some detail over the last year or two since the hype died down. And the sociology of that movement suggests a similar kind of upper middle class, educated, anti-politics, attitude-wielding segment of society that just cannot stand the fact that someone like Lalu Prasad is the chief minister of Bengal, or of Bihar, they just cannot get over it. How is this virtual, second-rate, uneducated, low-cost guy running the country, running the second or third biggest populated province of the country? And of course, this is where this whole debate that Partha Chatterjee has brought into sort of view in recent years sort of emerges. I have to admit, I'm not a big fan of the dichotomy that Chatterjee puts to us, because I don't think it's that clean a break between civil and political society. I think what he does well is tell us about the different methods of political engagement that do exist in societies such as ours. And he very, I think, appropriately tries to avoid a culturalist explanation, as if to suggest it is our culture that does it. Those are historically evolved methods of political engagement that have to do with the way the modern state, the apparatuses of the state, citizenship rights were or were not institutionalized from the colonial period. And so that, I fully agree with that larger sort of frame of trying to understand these methods of political engagement. I don't think it's as clean as saying, well, certain folks in society do this and certain folks do this. But I do think it's worth taking seriously, at least in the Pakistani context. And I don't know enough to say across the board in India, but that's my sense, too, that there is this well-educated upper middle class segment which is not thrilled about politics, to put it rather mildly, because politics is messy. The outcomes are neither the outcomes nor the process are particularly desirable. So, where does that leave us? I think for me, I think what's important to bear in mind is that, again, if I use a comparative, it's often said in Pakistan's case, I'd be the first one to pitch this, that continuity of the political process is at the very least, the bare minimum, the minimum requirement to both addressing things like, for example, the military's hegemony, to slowly undo established structures of power, and I would hold by that. But as the Indian experience suggests, that doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the quality of democracy per se. And in any case, I think what theorists like Chatterjee are trying to tell us is that the quality of democracy itself, in terms of normative analyses of what democracy should look like, we have to be wary of sort of assuming that there is one end product and it looks like this, and if it doesn't look like this, that means it's not worked. And I think that's the most important thing to be garnered from that sort of literature, and I think I take that very seriously. I think that's absolutely true. So there's no guarantee that our upper middle classes, the educated elite, which back in the days of the CSP and so on and so forth, perhaps were more, felt more confident that society was moving in the direction that they had control over, that they were guiding, the development of society. Again, very sort of colonial attitudes about how an educated, enlightened, segment of society can guide the backward, sort of uneducated masses, right, in the right direction. And I want to suggest to you, actually, this is the other thing that I think is worth us thinking about. While I do think that there's a lot of continuity vis-a-vis the unelected apparatus of the state, the military, the bureaucracy, in terms of the political role, in terms of, as I said, the military's growing economic clout, there's change there too within the institutions. So, back in the day, in Pakistan's case, up till 1973, the CSP, which was the elite cadre of the civil bureaucracy, was constituted almost entirely of this English-educated, ageism-going, upper middle class, with particular kinds of secular, westernized sensibilities. That's changed. That's also changed. Now, I teach at sort of probably, in terms of public universities in Pakistan, the university that I teach at, Islamabad, is sort of the hub of folks who want to go into the civil service. So anybody who comes to Qaeda University is basically there to get a degree and then to do the CSS exam, try and get inducted into the services. And the folks and the kids who come and study there now are no longer the educated English-speaking elite. Those are not the folks who want to become civil service officers. That category of society is much more disengaged now. It doesn't really want to have anything to do with the state. And I mean that in two ways. It's neither interested in guiding society and getting its hands dirty and doing, whether it be politics or doing administration. And it doesn't actually even need the state anymore. So, in Pakistan, if there's load shedding and you have money, who cares? Go buy a generator. You don't really have to bother with making sure that electricity provision, public service provision is sorted out. There's a general lack of concern. And so those folks who once upon a time went into the civil services, who were more engaged, who actually perhaps even went to public universities, shared public space, were concerned and therefore took an interest, now would rather be, in any case, it's much more lucrative to be working for a private company, a multinational, or going abroad and staying abroad. So the constitution of the state itself, in terms of the sociological makeup of state institutions, that's also changed. And a lot of sort of this the last point I'd like to make sort of does bring me back to the primary motive through which Pakistan is viewed, which is, as I said, the motive of violence, terrorism, and so on and so forth. You know, I would suggest to you that a lot of the very, you know, I think, understandable discontent and concern that both in the diaspora and at home, that sort of the elite has with what's happening. You know, there's a feeling, right? There's this general feeling within elite circles that, you know, the country is going to the dogs. What's happening? How is all this happening? How are all these? You know, why can't anybody get a grip on it? And you know, it's interesting. Within that segment of society, as I said, sort of lower middle class backgrounds, rural backgrounds, not English educated backgrounds, you know, there's these classes of people who are perhaps coming into the state, becoming state administrators. There's that level of discontent, or disquiet, or feeling like things are getting out of control. In fact, you know, when I talk to a majority of my students, and this is, I think, where I want to leave you, because I think this takes us to a lot of issues with regards to, you know, corruption and what democracy should look like, and so on and so forth. In fact, when you talk to these young adults and what they're trying to do, they say, look, we want access to the state because the state is power. And we don't harbor any, you know, delusions about why we want that power. We're not going there to solve the world's problems. We're not going there to serve the public interest, because there is no public interest. Because everyone who gets a shot does that. So why when it comes to us, should we suddenly, you know, grow a conscience and care? And what they want to say is that the same elite that in the drawing rooms talks about corruption and so on and so forth. Probably, for example, I'll give you the one statistic which I came across recently in a PhD by an old student who was studying the power sector in Pakistan, is that the largest amount of electricity theft in Pakistan in Karachi is in Defense and Clifton. In those same elite homes that are constantly decrying the corruption of politicians. So when that lower middle class kid from a small town who doesn't speak English, and he sees these gated communities and walls and riches and all sorts of stuff, telling him that you should be concerned about the public interest, he says, well, people in glass houses should not be throwing stones. And that general, and I think, you know, recently there was a big controversy erupted in India with Ashish Nandi's comments about corruption and poor people and how they are, you know, I mean, aside from the controversy itself, those sorts of debates, the kinds of debates that Chatterjee has brought out in the open, the kinds of debates that are emerging about what does democracy look like? This whole discourse of corruption, what is it all about? Who is talking corruption? Who is, you know, what does corruption signify? Is it the institutionalized, you know, rent-seeking of the very institutions of the state that continue to perpetuate anti-politics attitudes? Is it something else? And I think these are real questions that, you know, I think obviously in Pakistan we're going to be grappling with. I would hope, actually, I mean, I'll end on this. I hope that we'll be grappling with these for some time yet, because that means that we still have some kind of functioning procedural democracy to be talking about. I hope that we don't end up going back to those old debates about when will the military give up power, and how will we kick it out, and when will its foreign patrons stop patronizing it because it serves their geopolitical interests. Because we spent the best part of 65 years doing that when it comes to Pakistan. And that's perhaps explains a lot of why we look at what we perceive to be this mess of violence and sectarianism and so on and so forth. Those are all of those deeply entrenched structures that I would submit to you only genuinely engaged politics can provide solutions for, even if those solutions are not as glossy and as fine-tuned as we would like. Thank you very much.
Thank you.